There was an electric tension in the air, a breathless silence that settled between us on the worn couch, and when his fingers barely brushed across mine, I realized with a terrifying certainty that I didn't want this to end. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was 19 when I packed up my life in rural Pennsylvania, fleeing the familiar to carve out a space for myself in a small town just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. The southern heat hit me like a physical weight the moment I arrived. For a few months I crashed with my aunt, trying to find my footing, before finally renting a tiny, sweltering room above a local bakery. The smell of yeast and burnt sugar was a constant companion in those early days. I just wanted to start fresh and earn my own way. My ultimate dream back then was painfully simple. I desperately wanted to save up enough cash to buy a decent laptop and start working remotely as a virtual assistant. I spent my days hustling, juggling part-time gigs like babysitting and waitressing, but nothing was steady enough to get me ahead. Everything shifted on a suffocatingly hot morning when I spotted a faded flyer pinned to the community board downtown. A local greenhouse named Riverbend Garden and Supply was desperately looking for temporary seasonal help. The responsibilities were basic watering thirsty plants, arranging heavy terracotta pots, and helping wandering customers. It was only a 4-week stint, but the math worked out in my head. It was just enough money to cover my rent, and maybe get me a little closer to my laptop goal. I called the number scrawled at the bottom of the page, and by that very afternoon, I had secured the job. My first day on the floor was intensely sweaty, humid, and completely nerve-wracking. The foreman, a quiet man in his 40s named Harrison, was polite but entirely distant, keeping to himself as he directed the crew. I was quickly introduced to the other seasonal workers, discovering that most of them were older retired women, or folks just digging in the dirt for fun. But there was one guy who instantly stood out from the rest of the crew. He was tall, heavily broad-shouldered, usually dressed in a faded vintage band tee and endlessly dusty jeans. His hair had that effortless, just woke up kind of mess that made my stomach do a strange little flip. His name was Liam. He didn't say much at first, choosing to observe rather than speak. Our first real interaction happened when we abruptly bumped into each other near a stunning display of orchids, and his voice rumbled low as he murmured for me to be careful, noting that they were delicate, kinda like people. I stood there for a second, totally unsure if he was just making a dry joke or sharing some kind of hidden deep philosophy. Whatever it was, it made me smile. Over the next few sweltering days, we gravitated toward each other, talking more and more, mostly during our lunch breaks. We'd sit side by side on upturned plastic crates hidden behind the massive greenhouse. The conversations were effortless. We talked about nothing and absolutely everything. The oppressive heat, random TikToks, books we never bothered to finish, and the suffocating reality of our small-town boredom. His voice was intoxicatingly low and rough, a little husky in a very specific way that made my chest tighten instinctively whenever he said my name. I didn't have much money for a diverse wardrobe, so every day I wore the same light cotton dress. It was a little worn around the edges, but it hugged my hips gently, and my aunt had once told me I looked proper and feminine in it. I started to notice Liam's glances. They were never intrusive, never blatant or aggressive, but they were always just intensely present. It felt like he was meticulously mapping my shape with his dark eyes, but he was always perfectly careful never to cross a line. There was something incredibly steady and radiatingly warm in the way he looked at me, much like sunlight falling softly through drawn blinds. By the time the second week rolled around, the shift in my own feelings was undeniable. I started to deeply feel how much I looked forward to our lunch breaks, realizing I craved his presence significantly more than the paycheck I was earning. One particularly quiet afternoon, everyone else had packed up and gone home, but we willingly stayed behind, sitting in the humid stillness of the old lavender greenhouse. The light filtering through the glass was dusky and golden, the air incredibly warm and thick with the heavy scent of blooms. He didn't speak for a long while. Then, when our hands brushed accidentally against the wooden bench, he didn't pull away. His voice broke the silence as he quietly asked if I had ever been told I looked like morning dew. I blinked at him, my heart hammering against my ribs, completely unsure whether I was supposed to laugh at the sudden poetry. I asked if that was meant to be a compliment, and he simply nodded, his intense eyes fixed unblinkingly on mine, as he added that I was just as fresh and just as fleeting. Soon after, a new routine formed. He started walking me home after our exhausting shifts ended. We never rushed the journey. We just walked side by side down the fading suburban sidewalks, sometimes choosing to say nothing at all, letting the comfortable silence stretch. One humid evening I deliberately chose to wear a floral sundress paired with my soft ankle-strap sandals. When he looked down at my feet, his gaze was so heavy and deliberate. It felt as if he were reading poetry carved directly into my skin. Under his intense scrutiny, I felt deeply wanted, but never cheap. That specific look in his eyes was nothing short of reverent. But the definitive moment that shattered the tentative boundary between us and changed absolutely everything came unexpectedly. It was a hazy Friday evening, looming just before the inevitable end of my 4-week temp job. He casually asked if I wanted to take a detour and walk down to the lake. We gladly left the paved road behind and crossed a wide, sprawling meadow barefoot, the damp grass, feeling beautifully cool underfoot, while I carried my sneakers in my hands. He kindly carried my bag for me. When we finally reached the glassy surface of the lake, we sat down together incredibly close, our bodies positioned knee to knee, shoulder to shoulder. I turned to face him, the fading light catching his eyes, and I softly confessed that he knew I only took this grueling job to save up for a laptop. He didn't speak for a second, letting the weight of my words hang in the heavy air. Then he looked right into my eyes and whispered a confession that sent shivers down my spine. He thought he only took this job just to find me. Something violent and beautiful flipped inside my stomach. That singular line, so incredibly quiet, yet so devastatingly sure, stayed echoing within me long after our slow walk back to the bakery. I physically felt my breath catch sharply in my throat at the memory of it. I honestly didn't know where any of this was going, but I knew in my bones right then that this wasn't just a trivial summer job anymore. It wasn't even a fleeting summer crush. When he touched my hand by the water, just barely brushing his calloused fingers across my sensitive skin, I realized with absolute clarity that I didn't want this beautiful thing between us to end. Not in 4 weeks, and truthfully, not ever. After that magical evening at the lake, the entire world around me felt a little brighter, more vibrant. Liam didn't say anything grand or overly dramatic. He didn't aggressively try to kiss me under the sprawling canopy of stars, nor did he forcefully hold my hand as we navigated our way back to town. But the intense, lingering way he looked at me, so undeniably soft and unshakably certain, lingered heavily in the air between us, much like the intoxicating scent of crushed wildflowers lingering after a heavy summer rain. Over the next few days, he started showing up around my life more frequently, and not just during our scheduled shifts at work. One sticky evening, he surprisingly knocked on the flimsy door of my little upstairs rental and simply held out a crumpled brown paper bag revealing a slice of peach pie. He explained that his grandma had made it, and he thought I might want a slice. He never boldly asked to come inside the apartment. He just stood there awkwardly on the landing, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his dark eyes slowly scanning the chipped paint of my doorway, looking exactly like he was memorizing the rough edges of my isolated world without daring to step inside it. Sometimes he brought me other little thoughtful things: a sticky jar of golden honey sourced from a neighbor who kept bees, fresh basil stems carefully tied together in rustic twine, or once a chilled bottle of root beer simply because he remembered I had casually mentioned it. He remembered me saying that the soda reminded me of my childhood summers. His gestures were always small, always profoundly quiet. I would intentionally make sure to meet him at the door wearing my soft cotton robes or my comfortably worn t-shirts, and it was certainly not by accident. There was something incredibly intoxicating about the way he watched me. He was always deeply respectful. Yes, but underneath it all there was a kind of quiet, feral hunger that desperately made me want to be truly seen by him. We never sat down and formally talked about what we were doing, or what we were. Neither of us dared to call it anything out loud, but the physical and emotional space between us undeniably started to shrink. And then, one devastating evening, he simply didn't come. At first, I logically reasoned with myself, thinking that maybe he just got held up with some extra work. I told myself that maybe something unavoidable came up at home. But by the torturous second day, when all my desperate messages went completely unanswered, a deep, gnawing worry violently cracked open inside my chest. By the time the third morning rolled around, I couldn't take the suspense anymore. I marched down to the greenhouse, hiding behind the flimsy excuse of needing to buy more time for my windowsill planter. But Liam wasn't there. I cornered one of the older workers, a kindly woman named Harper, who bluntly told me that he had left. She mentioned that something urgent had happened with his dad. She speculated that she thought he went back home. She vaguely gestured, saying he went somewhere east. She didn't have any more concrete answers to offer me, and my throat was too tight, so I didn't push or ask. I mechanically walked all the way home with my new herbs tightly wrapped in brown paper, my legs feeling terrifyingly weak, like they were made of water. The midday sun felt far too bright against my stinging eyes. The surrounding town streets seemed overwhelmingly, unbearably loud. I collapsed onto the worn bench, sitting just outside the bakery, still dressed in my innocent summer dress with the little polka dots, the exact same one he once told me made me look far too innocent to actually be real. I stubbornly refused to cry. Not right then anyway, but the suffocating silence he left behind absolutely burned. A grueling, agonizing week passed by, and then agonizingly another. I slowly started to tragically believe that maybe I had just stupidly imagined the whole profound connection. I convinced myself that he'd never really been mine to begin with. My anxious mind spiraled, suggesting that maybe he secretly had someone else waiting for him. Or even worse, I feared that I'd simply been far too much for him to handle, that I'd accidentally scared him off by wanting him too badly, and entirely too soon. And then, one incredibly late night, long after I had already brushed my teeth, and numbly curled up on my lumpy couch wearing an old, faded gray dress, I finally heard the heavy knock at my door. I scrambled to open the door, and there he was standing in the dim hall light, his heavy backpack slung carelessly over one broad shoulder. His handsome face looked utterly exhausted, his sharp jaw was rough with days of dark stubble, and his eyes were lowered to the floorboards, looking exactly like a guilty boy who fully expected to be turned away and rejected. He spoke quietly, his voice raspy, explaining that he was in Lexington dealing with his dad. He explained that his dad had gotten real sick, and that the whole traumatic situation had moved incredibly fast. He kept his eyes averted, confessing that he didn't want to selfishly drag me into the mess, and that he genuinely didn't know how to adequately explain the chaos to me. He finished his sentence by simply saying, I am sorry, I couldn't speak." My chest ached violently from all the days of stubbornly holding my intense emotions in. He nervously stepped just a fraction closer, just enough so that I could physically feel his radiating body warmth gently touch my skin like a physical whisper. He looked up and breathed out that he missed me. I stared right back at him, looking deeply into those incredibly worn-out, soulful eyes. And this time, I absolutely didn't turn away from the intensity. When our trembling lips finally met, the collision was agonizingly slow. It was deeply careful. It felt exactly like a fragile page finally turning in a beautiful book that we'd both been terrified to finish reading. His first kiss wasn't rushed or aggressive, and honestly, maybe that is exactly what completely broke my defenses down. The sheer restraint of it, the staggering honesty in the movement, the subtle way his large frame trembled just a tiny bit, as if he completely didn't trust his own body not to fall way too fast. When we eventually pulled apart to catch our breath, I could barely manage to breathe at all. My knees violently shook beneath my gray dress, but I knew definitively that it wasn't out of fear anymore. He tenderly touched my flushed cheek, his rough thumb gently brushing the highly sensitive skin sitting just below my earlobe. He murmured softly into the space between us that I smelled like mint. I whispered back, my voice barely audible, that I didn't wear perfume. He smiled a genuine relieved smile, telling me that was good, and that he liked it better that way. And then, defying all my racing expectations, he took a step back toward the hallway. He didn't boldly ask to stay the night. He just offered me one final, piercing look, as if he was communicating a silent, unbreakable promise, telling me that he came back, and that he would always do it again. However, after he came back into my life, things didn't just magically fall into an effortless place. Liam still maintained his sweet routine of bringing me little tokens of affection, like a carton of fresh, vibrant strawberries, or a sticky jar of dark fig preserves he picked up from a local farmer's market. He still knocked on my apartment door softly, never loud or demanding. He still patiently waited on the landing for me to explicitly invite him inside. But undeniably, something fundamental in the air between us had shifted. I had naively expected that after sharing such a profound kiss, our dynamic would rapidly shift and that we'd effortlessly become closer, not just in our intertwined spirits, but physically in body. I spent days constantly waiting for him to reach his hands out for me, to forcefully pull me closer to his chest, to finally let the agonizing physical space separating us dissolve entirely. But he never did. We would routinely sit out on my creaky wooden porch in the heavy, warm twilight, the skin of his muscular arm just barely brushing against mine, and yet he still stubbornly wouldn't lean in to kiss me again. He would smile at my jokes, but I noticed the smile only ever reached his mouth, completely failing to light up his guarded eyes. We spent countless hours drinking hot tea, talking aimlessly about absolutely nothing, discussing movies, sharing our hidden dreams, and analyzing how he once genuinely thought escaping to Montana sounded like the ultimate definition of freedom. Yet, despite the talking, there was always a thin, impenetrable wall standing firmly between us. It was totally invisible. It was endlessly frustrating. I slowly started aggressively questioning everything about myself and the relationship. Was my personality simply too much for him to handle? Was I acting too forward? Or ironically, was I not doing enough to show him I wanted him? One sticky evening, the frustration boiled over, and I decisively made up my mind to stop passively waiting around. I deliberately set the mood, lighting soft candles around the room, and I purposefully wore my favorite delicate lace bralette hidden beneath a flowy, loose white shirt. I made sure the collar slid off one of my shoulders just right, left my hair curled and soft, and applied a faintly sweet, tasting lip gloss. I truly wasn't trying to aggressively seduce him. Not exactly, anyway. Deep down, I just desperately wanted to be truly seen by him. I needed to feel wanted. When Liam finally arrived at my door, looking beautifully dusty and exhausted from a brutally long day of labor, proudly carrying a brown paper bag full of fresh peaches, I immediately stood up and pulled him into a tight hug, intentionally holding onto his solid frame significantly longer than I usually did. I softly asked if he had a rough day, my fingertips lightly tracing the sensitive skin at the nape of his neck. He gave a tired nod in response. He mumbled a quiet kinda as an answer. We moved to the couch, and I deliberately sat right next to him, my bare legs tucked comfortably under me, positioning myself close enough that our knees were physically touching. The small lamp positioned beside the couch glowed with a warm golden hue, casting deep, intimate shadows across the sharp planes of his face. Taking a deep breath, I subtly shifted my posture just slightly, just enough to intentionally let the neckline of my loose shirt slip a tiny bit lower, just enough for the intricate edge of the lace bralette to become highly visible. He instantly noticed the movement. His entire body visibly froze on the cushions. Then, breaking the thick silence, he quietly asked, his voice strained, if I was cold. I blinked, slightly thrown off by the deflection. I told him no. He awkwardly offered to go get me a blanket. I stopped him by saying his name, Liam. I bravely reached out for his large, calloused hand and placed it gently directly onto my bare thigh, right over the thin fabric of my dress. His broad palm felt incredibly warm against my skin, but his long fingers were completely rigidly tense. Maintaining intense eye contact, I boldly told him, "I want you to be closer." He didn't rip his hand away from my leg, but agonizingly, he didn't lean in to close the gap either. His voice was incredibly husky and thick with suppressed emotion when he finally confessed that it was really hard for him. He admitted the struggle of being sitting right next to me and desperately trying not to lose his control. I tilted my head, studying his tortured expression. I challenged him, asking softly, "Do you have to stay in control?" He offered a tiny, sad smile, but his dark eyes remained deadly serious as he replied, "With you, yeah." I pushed further, asking what would happen if he didn't stay in control. He immediately predicted that I would run away from him. I fiercely promised that I wouldn't run, but deep down we both silently knew that given my past, I might. The tension radiating in the small room was violently electric. The sheer act of him not touching me anywhere else still felt exactly like a roaring fire between us. Slowly, agonizingly, he removed his hand from my thigh and placed it safely back onto his own lap. His voice dropped even lower as he vulnerably confessed that he had this deeply ingrained bad habit. He explained that whenever things in his life got to be too much emotionally, he would just go completely quiet. He admitted that his instinct was to just disappear. I felt a sharp, painful twist deep inside my chest at his confession. He quickly rushed to assure me, claiming that it wasn't my fault. He explained that running away was simply how he had learned to cope with life. I nodded slowly, processing his fear. I told him that I understood he was terrified that I wouldn't be able to understand his baggage. His rigid shoulders dropped just a tiny fraction, looking as though I had precisely hit the agonizing truth he was hiding. I leaned in and whispered fiercely, "I do understand," promising him, "and I am still here." He leaned his large body over then, and very gently pressed his warm lips directly to my forehead, offering absolutely nothing more than that chaste contact. But somehow that incredibly soft, profoundly still kiss held infinitely more meaning and devotion than any wild night of passion I could have ever imagined in my head. That same night we ended up lying side by side on the cramped cushions of the couch. His heavy hand rested incredibly lightly against the curve of my hip, remaining strictly over the fabric of my clothes. With my eyes peacefully closed, I listened to my own heart pounding loudly. Realizing the racing beat wasn't stemming from fear anymore. but rather from something infinitely gentler. It was hope, the very quiet, profound kind of hope. After that deeply vulnerable night on the couch, something fundamental between us finally softened. We didn't feel the need to dissect or talk about the shift the following morning. We simply didn't need to. Liam left my apartment early, sneaking out just after the sun began to rise, gently brushing a soft kiss against my temple before he walked out the door with that signature slow, steady rhythm that was so uniquely his. There were no grand, sweeping promises made between us. There was absolutely no anxious overthinking allowed. There was just his consistent, reassuring presence. He continually kept showing up for me. We organically built a life of comforting routines. Every single Friday, we would walk together down the road to his grandmother's house to pick up jars of her fresh honey. Every Sunday, without fail, we would board the rusty local train and ride it 2 towns over, sometimes just to buy roasted sunflower seeds at the sprawling outdoor market. Other times, we took the train just to find a quiet spot to sit by the shimmering water, kicking our shoes off so our bare toes could curl deeply into the sun-warmed grass. I continued to wear my simple, everyday clothes, faded denim skirts, old comfortable tank tops, and my beat-up white sneakers. But I made sure there was always a tiny, subtle detail meant just to catch his observant eye, a delicate silver charm on my anklet, the bright strap of my bra purposefully peeking out from under a basic cotton tee, or a brand new sweet lotion I bought that smelled exactly like fresh clover. Liam, with his quiet intensity, noticed absolutely everything about me. His dark eyes would purposefully linger on me just a little bit longer with each passing day, and whenever that heavy gaze fell on me, I truly felt like the most authentic, real version of myself. He bravely started looking deeply into my eyes more frequently, refusing to look away and confidently holding my gaze. His physical touch evolved too. He didn't flinch away nervously anymore. His hands hovered confidently. They stayed where he placed them. His rough fingertips would slowly, agonizingly trace the sensitive skin on the inside of my wrist while we had casual conversations, moving precisely like he was attempting to map the exact rhythm of my racing pulse. The breaking point of that beautiful restraint happened on a random Tuesday. As I stretched my body upward, reaching for a glass jar sitting uselessly on the very top shelf in my cramped kitchen, he suddenly stepped directly in behind my body. He stood impossibly close. His large, warm hand slid confidently to rest on the small of my lower back, effortlessly steadying my balance. His lips were hovering so close they were almost physically touching my ear as he huskily asked if I always stretched like that. I breathed out a reply, telling him I only did it when I explicitly knew that someone was watching me. He smiled against my skin, and he didn't dare move away from my body. Later that exact same evening, he reached out and gently unbuttoned the very top button of my soft cardigan, focusing on just that one single button. He moved agonizingly slowly. He was so incredibly careful. I stood there, barely remembering to breathe. I knew deeply that the gesture wasn't really about the physical button. It was entirely about him asking for my permission. It was a monumental act of trust. That beautiful night, we finally lay together in my bed, no longer acting as strangers, and not quite acting as fully realized lovers either, but rather existing perfectly as something magical caught right in between. We were undeniably something that was in the process of becoming. His heavy arm rested incredibly lightly across my waist. My bare leg was comfortably draped over his. We didn't rush the physical intimacy. We completely refused to put a rigid name on what we were doing. The emotional floodgates opened wide one quiet evening while we were casually sitting on my kitchen floor, happily eating slices of leftover pie straight from the tin and washing it down with mugs of lukewarm tea. He stopped eating, turned his head to look directly at me, to really look deep into my soul, and painfully confessed, "I don't know what is wrong with me." I instantly froze, feeling incredibly unsure of how to navigate his sudden darkness. But he quickly continued, his voice thick with raw emotion, telling me, "But you make me want to figure it out," he clarified, stating fiercely, "Not for you, for me. So I can be someone who is whole enough to be with you." I completely lost the ability to speak. I physically couldn't form the words. My throat tightened painfully with unshed tears. So, instead of offering empty platitudes, I simply wrapped both of my arms tightly around his neck, firmly pressed my face into the solid warmth of his chest, and allowed the heavy silence in the room to perfectly say all the things that my clumsy words simply couldn't. Our life together wasn't flawlessly perfect. There were still heavy, dark days where he would suddenly go completely quiet. Days where his traumatic inner thoughts violently pulled him back to a dark place where I couldn't physically follow him. But the miraculous difference now was that he always, eventually, came back to me. And I steadfastly stayed right there waiting for him. I didn't stay merely out of a desperate fear of losing him. I stayed because, beneath all of his jagged edges and undeniable brokenness, I clearly saw a soul that felt exactly like coming home. We had successfully established a beautiful, predictable rhythm to our shared lives now. It was never rushed or frantic. It was never loud or aggressively demanding. We were just two slightly damaged people, actively figuring out life together in the deeply quiet, hidden corners of our everyday existence. I would frequently come home exhausted from a grueling morning shift at the local cafe, my clothes smelling intensely like roasted espresso beans and sticky cinnamon rolls, only to find him standing in my tiny kitchen. He would be totally barefoot, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up his forearms, expertly flipping homemade pancakes on the stove, as if cooking breakfast for dinner was the most natural, ordinary thing in the entire world. I loved teasing him, leaning against the doorframe one night and loudly joking, asking if he always made a habit of breaking into people's apartments just to aggressively cook them breakfast foods. At 6 p.m., he completely refused to even look up from the sizzling skillet as he deadpanned his response. He quietly told me, "Only for you." He flipped a pancake and softly added, "And only when I've missed your face all day." Truthfully, he made the absolute worst pancakes on the planet. They were always burnt crisp on the outer edges and disgustingly too thick and doughy in the middle. But I happily ate every single bite of them anyway. I would sit cross-legged on the hard kitchen floor, my bare knees heavily dusted with rogue white flour, just watching him eat. Once he had a smudge of sticky fruit jam smeared right on his cheek. I reached out and tenderly wiped it off using my thumb, and I purposefully didn't pull my hand away from his face afterward. Our mornings were just as intimate. Sometimes my internal clock would wake me up incredibly early, long before the sun had even begun to rise. I would find him sleeping peacefully right next to me, his heavy hand resting protectively on my waist, his rhythmic, warm breath ghosting gently against the skin of my bare shoulder. In those stolen moments, I would just lie perfectly still, quietly watching his dark eyelashes twitch in his sleep, deeply listening to the incredibly quiet, comforting hum of him simply existing beside me. But the nights weren't always peaceful. Other times, the darkness would win, and he would violently wake up gasping for air in the pitch black. He was clearly fighting off some horrific nightmare that he staunchly refused to ever talk to me about. During those episodes, he would quickly turn his broad back away from me, aggressively pressing the hard heel of his hand deep into his forehead, looking exactly like a man desperately trying to physically push the horrific memory back inside his skull. I never pushed him to explain the terror. I never interrogated him. Instead, I would silently slide my warm hand directly under the fabric of his shirt, firmly pressing my flat palm flush against his racing heart, craving that grounding skin-to-skin contact. After a grueling minute or two of fighting his demons, his rigid body would finally exhale, and he would turn to me and whisper a strained thanks. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he would drift right back off to sleep, acting entirely like nothing bad had ever happened. I intimately knew that there was a massive, crushing weight he continuously carried on his shoulders. It was undeniably something deeply rooted from his life long before he ever met me. It was a dark, festering wound that I humbly knew I hadn't yet earned the ultimate right to touch or heal. But I truly didn't feel the desperate need to instantly fix his trauma. My only goal was that I just desperately wanted to be the safe place he instinctively came back to whenever the outside world got far too heavy for him to carry alone. To anchor ourselves, we religiously started observing these beautiful, tiny little rituals. We maintained our sacred every Friday honey run to his grandmother's house, and our mandatory every Sunday train ride that inevitably led to a long, winding walk straight through the heart of town. We absolutely never skipped them, treating them like a religion. As we walked now, he would confidently hold my hand right out in the open. He never gripped my hand too tightly. He held it just enough so that our fingers constantly brushed against each other before finally locking together. And whenever he inevitably had to let my hand go to open a door or pay for something, the separation never felt like a painful absence. It merely felt like a brief, temporary pause before we connected again. One particularly lazy Sunday afternoon, we found ourselves sitting in the deep shade under a massive ancient oak tree growing right near the edge of the river. I comfortably rested the weight of my head directly onto his lap, letting the bright afternoon sun deeply warm the skin of my bare arms. He lazily, methodically ran his long fingers through the tangled strands of my hair, moving incredibly slowly, exactly like a man who had absolutely nowhere else in the world he needed to be. He looked like a man who had no one else left on earth to try and impress. Staring down at me, his voice barely above a whisper, he confessed, "You make it easy to stay." I slowly opened my eyes, blinking up at the canopy of leaves, and asked him, "Stay where?" He didn't hesitate before answering, "Right here." That very same night, after we navigated our way back to my cramped place, his entire demeanor had shifted towards a beautiful certainty. He didn't passively wait for me to explicitly ask for his help. He just stepped right up to the sink and helped me wash the towering pile of dirty dishes. He meticulously dried every single plate and cup with a towel, carefully setting each one perfectly into the drying rack, as if the mundane chore deeply mattered to him. And when I finally turned my body toward him to say thank you for the help, he boldly leaned all the way in and kissed me. He finally kissed me in the exact, desperate way I'd been agonizingly waiting for him to do for months. The kiss wasn't careful, it wasn't hesitant or overly gentle. It was just utterly, completely full of everything he had been holding back. It honestly wasn't the kind of cinematic kiss that came exploding with loud fireworks. Instead, it was the specific, deeply profound kind of kiss that permanently grounded your soul to the earth. The kind of kiss that undeniably told you that you were never going to be alone in the world anymore. When we finally breathlessly pulled apart from each other, he remained entirely silent. He just slowly pivoted his head, looking intently all around the cramped confines of my tiny room. He scanned the walls, looking exactly like a man who was actively trying to permanently memorize every single water damage, crack etched into the plaster ceiling, and every single uneven, scuffed tile glued to the kitchen floor. Then, turning his intense gaze back to me, he spoke so incredibly quietly that he sounded like he wasn't entirely sure I'd even be able to hear the words. He stated clearly, "We should move," he elaborated, adding the word together. He mapped out a vision, suggesting we go somewhere quieter. He painted a picture of our future, muttering, "Maybe a little house with a porch." He frantically started planning out loud, promising, "I'll find work. We'll grow tomatoes or whatever people do when they're not pretending life's just a temporary thing." I stood completely frozen by the sink, and I just blinked at him. My brain misfired, and all I could manage to intelligently repeat back to him was the word "move." He stepped closer, looking right into my soul. There was absolutely no lingering fear left in his dark eyes. There was just raw, unfiltered truth. He bared his soul, fiercely confessing, "I want something real, and you are the only real thing I've ever had." My throat immediately tightened with a wave of overwhelming emotion. When I finally managed to answer his life-altering proposal, my voice came out as barely a fragile whisper. I accepted his offer, but playfully added my one single condition. Only if the windows faced the garden. Hearing my answer, a genuine, radiant smile broke across his face. It was that specific, soft, charmingly crooked, devastatingly beautiful smile that I painfully hadn't seen grace his features in weeks. And looking at that smile, I knew right then and there with absolute, unshakable certainty that we weren't just two lost kids aimlessly trying to survive anymore. We were actively building a real life. Despite the grand declaration by the sink, we didn't actually pack up and move right away. There were stacks of empty cardboard boxes sitting in the corner that we never bothered to pack. There were dozens of saved online real estate listings sitting on my laptop that we bookmarked, but never actually bothered to call the realtors on. For the time being, we comfortably stayed put right there in my tiny, cramped upstairs apartment, completely ignoring the way the old pipes aggressively rattled in the walls and the way the cheap floorboards loudly creaked whenever you leaned too heavily near the kitchen sink. But somehow, despite the flaws, living in that tiny box together felt like it was more than enough. Liam quickly picked up a new, physically demanding job, working on a local landscaping crew. He would constantly come home to me smelling overwhelmingly like sharp pine needles and damp red clay. He frequently sported a bright red sunburn across the back of his thick neck, and his rough fingers were always covered in tiny stinging nicks he got from ruthlessly pulling landscaping wire all day. I kept up my daily grind, working my chaotic morning shifts, pulling espresso shots at the cafe, and then spending my long afternoons hunched over my laptop, meticulously editing fluffy blog posts for some demanding mom influencer based out in Oregon who strictly paid me per word. Through all the chaos of the daily grind, we were beautifully, simply still just us. Our life together was messy. It was agonizingly slow, but above all else, it was undeniably real. Some lazy nights, we were too exhausted to cook, so we literally just ate bowls of cold cereal for dinner. Other magical nights, the energy would strike us, and we would wildly dance around in the tiny kitchen, blasting songs from my phone that we barely even knew the lyrics to. He would grab my hands, twirling me around barefoot on the slippery linoleum tile, acting exactly like we were celebrating at a joyous wedding that neither of us had actually bothered to plan yet. He definitely still had his dark moments of suffocating silences. Sometimes the ghosts of his past would win, and he would just stand there and stare blankly out the living room window for agonizing minutes at a time, his sharp jaw locked tight with unbearable tension. Over time, I patiently learned not to aggressively press him for answers during those storms. I simply sat down quietly right beside him, pressing my thigh flush against his thigh, patiently waiting for the erratic rhythm of his breathing to finally even out and return to normal. Eventually, he began to trust me enough to tell me the dark things from his past, feeding me the information in tiny, digestible pieces. He quietly told me about the violent, screaming fights he used to have with his demanding dad. He confessed the agonizing details about the toxic girl who had once completely broken his heart without ever even having to raise her voice to do it. He admitted the heartbreaking truth about the countless freezing nights he had purposely slept alone inside the cramped cab of his rusted truck, with the engine turned completely off, desperately doing it just so he could finally feel absolutely nothing for a few hours. And then, one crisp, unforgettable morning, he abruptly woke me up long before the sun had even hinted at rising. He gently shook my shoulder and whispered into the dark room. "Come on." I buried my face deeper into my pillow and loudly groaned, complaining that it was still pitch dark outside. He didn't care, he simply replied, "I know, come anyway." I dragged myself out of bed, and we groggily drove his truck 20 minutes straight out of the sleeping town, navigating up a violently bumpy, winding dirt road that realistically looked like it hadn't seen a set of tire tracks in several months. When we finally reached the very top of the steep hill, the dense trees broke open to reveal a massive, breathtaking clearing. It was completely barren except for a patch of wild grass, some scattered jagged rocks, and one single lonely wooden bench that was perfectly positioned facing dead east. He silently reached into the bed of his truck, handed me a thick woven blanket to block the morning chill, pulled a second one over his own lap, and we simply sat down together on the wood. We sat there, just waiting. No profound words were spoken between us. The only sounds echoing in the clearing were the rustic noises of the morning birds slowly stirring in the trees, and the chilling sound of the morning wind rushing past us, sounding exactly like it was catching its own breath. And then the dark sky finally broke wide open. The horizon violently exploded into a canvas of soft, delicate pinks, blending into deep bruised purples, culminating in that very first blinding shard of pure gold sliding dramatically up over the tree line. I watched the sky, but Liam didn't even bother to look at the majestic sunrise. Instead, he completely ignored the horizon and just looked directly at me. He softly broke the silence, confessing to me that he used to drive up here and desperately watch sunrises alone on the nights when his demons wouldn't let him sleep. He explained his tortured logic, stating that he always thought that maybe, if he just forced himself to sit still for long enough, something in the chaotic universe would finally start to make sense to him. He reached out across the bench and gently took my cold hand into his warm one. His rough thumb soothingly brushed back and forth across my knuckles as he heartbreakingly finished his thought, admitting that watching the sky never actually fixed anything. He paused, locking his eyes with mine, and whispered, "Not until now." I didn't try to answer his confession with words. I just slowly leaned my body into his side, gratefully resting the heavy weight of my head securely onto his broad shoulder. I closed my eyes and simply let the intense, radiating warmth of the rising sun slowly sink deep into my freezing skin. And sitting there on that bench, for the absolute first time in a very, very long time, my anxious mind went completely quiet, and I finally didn't agonizingly wonder what terrible thing was going to happen next in my life. I completely let go of the desperate need to officially name what we were doing. I didn't need to draft up a rigid, foolproof plan for our future anymore. Sitting right there beside him, surrounded by that brilliant golden quiet of the morning, I had a profound realization. I finally understood that some forms of true love simply don't arrive accompanied by deafening thunder. The best kind of love doesn't violently knock you off your feet, and it certainly doesn't dangerously burn itself into the sky in a blaze of destructive glory. Some love, the rare kind, just stays. It faithfully walks right beside you through the agonizingly slow mornings. It endures the tragically burnt pancakes. It survives the panic of missed phone calls, and it heals you through the profound power of quiet, everyday forgiveness. It sits quietly on a bench with you, just watching the morning light finally come in to chase away the darkness. And most importantly, it never selfishly asks you for anything in return, other than the simple, beautiful room to just continue to grow.